It doesn't matter how much money you have. It doesn't matter how much money you plan to spend in retirement. Making the transition from your working years while you're in your career to retirement, that's a challenging transition for just about everybody. While you're working, you have money coming in from your job every month, rain or shine, hopefully. You have that money that comes in. You use it to pay your expenses, mortgage, groceries, utilities, entertainment, travel, what have you, taxes. And then if you're living within your means, you hopefully have a little bit left over at the end of the month. You go from that to giving up the income from work. And now, in order to pay for those exact same expenses, you're taking money out of your long-term savings, perhaps with a little bit of help from Social Security or a pension, perhaps some kind of annuity income, what have you. There are a lot of options there. That's a traumatic transition for a lot of people because there are just so many unknowns in retirement. How can we confirm that the pile, our long-term savings, is big enough to last us the rest of our lives, right? We don't know how long we're going to live. We don't know how our healthcare expenses are going to look 20, 30 years from now, whether we might need help in an assisted living kind of setting. We don't know what inflation is going to look like or exactly what the markets are going to do over the next decade or two. There are a lot of unknowns here, which makes this a pretty traumatic experience. In our financial planning firm, we've talked to people who've made that transition with $20 million saved. We've talked to people who've made that transition with $500,000 saved. It doesn't matter how much you have saved up. It's traumatic for everybody. So in today's video, what we're going to do is walk through a hypothetical case study of someone trying to retire at age 62 with $2.2 million. We'll cover the ins and outs of their profile and their situation. I picked this because this is a pretty common thing that we see every week in our firm, and we'll go through a few pieces of our software to help determine whether this person has enough saved up, what some of the long-term risks are, what they should be wary of, what some of the opportunities are, and where this might go awry for them. So here's the situation. Let's assume that our couples, that their names are Jeff and Abby. They're 62 years old. They'd like to retire effective immediately if they can, but they're not totally sure that's a good idea. So like I mentioned, we're assuming they have a total of $2.2 million saved up across their investment accounts. Now, these days, most people are not saving exclusively in one type of account. We have a variety of 401ks and IRAs and Roths and taxable accounts that we can all kind of access depending on the circumstances. And we'll assume that Jeff and Abby have $1.5 million saved up across their tax deferred assets. That's 401ks, IRAs, accounts kind of like that. Let's assume that they have another 250,000 saved in Roth accounts that they've already paid tax on and will not pay tax on when they take money out of the accounts in the future. And then on top of that, let's assume that they have 450,000 saved in taxable investment accounts. That could be a joint account in their names, maybe in the name of their living trust, something to that effect. Now, on top of that, outside of their investment assets, let's assume that they own their house. It's worth about $900,000. They still have a mortgage. The balance is $325,000. They pay 4% interest on that mortgage. And they have an emergency fund in cash of $75,000, just sitting in the bank ready for a rainy day. Now, side note, it's a very sound decision to have an emergency fund in place before you ever think about taking market risk with any kind of investment. And $75,000 might be very appropriate for Jeff and Lisa. Some people out there will like to consider the cash in the emergency fund as part of the portfolio. We recommend you don't really do that because that shouldn't be considered an investment asset. That should be considered an emergency asset in case you need it in a pinch. Now, as far as their spending needs go, we're going to assume that Jeff and Abby need to spend $12,500 per month to survive. And part of that is that mortgage payment of a little bit more than $2,000 a month. And on top of that, let's assume that they have Social Security benefits that they'll be eligible for either now or some point in the future. Now, remember that you're eligible to file for Social Security benefits as early as age 62. Often you don't want to. So they might have the ability to go in and file for their Social Security benefits if they retire immediately, because that's the earliest that they can claim them. But by doing so, they're permanently reducing the amount that they'll get in terms of a monthly check. Their full retirement ages, let's assume, are age 67. And if they file at age 67, they'll be entitled to $2,850 a month. Now, as far as their investments go, let's assume that their portfolio is invested consistently across their accounts in terms of asset allocation. Let's assume that they have just a basic, very standard allocation of 60% stocks, 40% bonds. Within that 60% in equities, 35% of that is in the US, 22% is in other countries, so non-US equities, and 3% are in alternatives like real estate investment trust. Now, of the 40% in bonds, let's assume that 35 of that 40% are in US bonds and 5% are in bonds kind of sprinkled out around the rest of the world. The reason that's relevant is because if we're going to build a retirement projection and analyze this, we have to have an idea of how diversified those investment accounts are and what their expected returns might be over a long-term period of time based on how much risk they're taking. And over a long period of time, when you run the math on how a portfolio like this has done in general, it returns somewhere between 7 and 7.25% per year. Well, 7 and 7.5% per year, I should say. So in our analysis, we're going to assume that their investment portfolio remains allocated just as it is, and it produces about 7.25% per year in returns. So typically, when we're trying to determine whether someone's nest egg is large enough to last them for the rest of their life, there's a whole bunch of different analytical methods that we want to use to kind of give the thumbs up or thumbs down. And when you put them all together, it really uncovers a lot of information about whether this is a good idea to give up your income or not. And so in this circumstance, we're looking at Jeff and Abby, and you can see that their assets are starting to go down over the course of their retirement. Now, I should explain what we're looking at here. This screen takes all the variables that we just went over, including asset allocation and spending needs and Social Security and taxes and what they have inside of all of their investment accounts. And then it assumes that each of their investments is going to grow every single year at the long-term rate of return without deviation. Now, this is a helpful starting point, but as you may know, there is no free lunch in investing, and that is never going to happen. If you have a portfolio invested in a mix of stocks and bonds, doesn't matter whether you're 50-50, 60-40, 90-10, it doesn't matter. There are going to be variations on a year-to-year basis. You're never going to have the same return every single year because the reason that we get good returns out of those growth assets is because we have to take a fair amount of risk, sometimes a lot of risk, by investing in them in the first place. And in this view, we're assuming that Jeff and Abby earn that long-term rate of return we were talking about 7.25% every year, no matter what. And that is never going to happen. But it's helpful as a starting point for our retirement projections because we can see what their portfolio assets tend to do over time. And you can see that they tend to go down here over the course of their retirement. If they live to age 100, they'd have maybe a little more than half of what they have today. But this might be a viable path just at the outset. Now, the next thing I want to look at in this situation has to do with the cash flows and distribution rates. So as we talked about, Jeff and Abby have a couple different types of retirement accounts. They have Roth IRAs, they have a mix of 401ks and IRAs, tax deferred money, and they have taxable investments. Now, which of those accounts are they going to take from first? What are the tax repercussions? And ultimately, what are we expecting here for distribution rates early in their retirement? Now, sometimes it's easy to resort to a rule of thumb, like the 4% retirement distribution rule, or something along the lines of the Trinity study, which is an extension of the 4% rule. Just very briefly, the 4% rule is a helpful rule of thumb. It was produced by a financial planner named Bill Bengen back in the 90s. He had a bunch of clients who were about to retire, and so he looked at the performance of the S&P 500 and 5-year US T-bills over rolling 30-year periods. And he grabbed a bunch of data and he went all the way back to 1927. He said, hey, if I retire in 1927 and I live for 30 years, what's the maximum I can take out of my accounts every single year adjusted for inflation without ever running out of money based on those returns over that 30-year period. And then he slid forward to the next 30-year period, starting in 1928, then starting in 1929. So he went forward and used all this data to figure out that even in most 30-year retirement periods, you can take out more of your portfolio than 4% every single year. You could take out 5, 6, 7, sometimes 8, 9% of your year one portfolio value, take that amount plus inflation out every single year and never run out of money. But even in the most unfortunate circumstances where you hit a really bad market and things are not going your way, 4% was the one distribution rate that worked in all of the circumstances. So a lot of times when we have these discussions with people, they like to resort to that 4% rule of thumb or something like it. And if you look at your year one distribution rate and you say, oh no, that's 6%, I'm going to run out of money. Well, it's not quite as black and white as that, because we need to take taxes into account. And I'll tell you, after having done this a couple hundred times, that nobody's spending needs are consistent throughout their retirement. Nobody's guaranteed income is consistent. For example, Jeff and Abby, we're assuming that they're going to spend the exact same amount every single month plus inflation for the rest of their lives, right? That's probably not going to happen, but let's just assume that's true for the moment. But they want to retire at 62. We're expecting their Social Security benefits are not going to come in until they're 67. So that means that over this 5-year window, right when they retire, they're going to have to take out more from their investments than they will in their later 60s and beyond. So if they're spending $12,500 per month, all of that is going to have to come out of their investments. When they turn their Social Security on, let's say that that's $2,850, then they have to take that much less out of their investments at that point, and that reduces the distribution rate. So off the bat, what I see here is we have our taxable investment accounts, we have our retirement accounts, and then we have our cash emergency fund. And what will happen is we have our living expense needs. That amount comes out of the portfolio. And typically what we like to begin with is taking money out of taxable investments first, and then hit our retirement accounts after that. Usually your tax deferred accounts and then your Roth accounts last. So if you do the math on this and you divide the net cash outflow of about 150,000 by the portfolio value, you get about 7%. And that looks like it's too high of a distribution rate. And it might be, we don't know that yet. But my point is that 7% is probably going to go down once Social Security benefits start coming in, and mean that we have to take less out of our accounts. Now, the next iteration of this is called a Monte Carlo analysis. And what this is we can instruct the program to run 1,000 different trials, knowing the last 100 or so years of market history, knowing the probabilities that they go up and down, and and how that might impact the rest of the plan. Remember, the program knows everything about the spending, the taxes, the contents of the portfolio, how much risk they're taking. And you can apply this probabilistic statistical analysis to run a bunch of trials and just see in how many of them did Jeff and Abby get to age 100 with some money in the bank, and in how many of them did they work their accounts down to zero. And you can see here that we're starting off with, they use the term probability of success. Really, that's the probability that you don't have to make a change, of 61%. So we're kind of in the ballpark here to start, but 61% is a little bit lower than we typically like, because there's a lot of bad things that can happen. The market could crash. Remember all the uncertainties that we talked about at the beginning of the video. You might have unexpected healthcare expenses. You might need to stay in an assisted living facility. There's all sorts of things that can happen. Now, what we also don't want is a 100% chance of success, because that probably means you have more resources that you could use to your own benefit. And yeah, maybe you could ratchet up your spending, stay at nicer hotels when you travel. Those are kind of the obvious ones. But if you're happy and content with your current spending level, then you could give more to charity. You could leave more for your family or other people. There are all sorts of variations for this. The point of this whole exercise is to make sure that we're Number one, that we have a large enough savings, a large enough nest egg, a large enough pile to last us the rest of our life. And then once that's confirmed, we want to make sure that we're utilizing that in a way that is most fulfilling to us. That's the whole point of the exercise. And that looks different to everybody. Some people might want to leave a lot to their church or another charity. Other people might want to maximize a bequest to kids. We have a lot of other clients who want to bounce the last check that they write, and that's a completely defensible and something we totally support if that's what you want to do as well. So we haven't tinkered with this yet, but as a starting point, 61% is a little bit lower than where we like to see. We like to see somewhere between 70, 75, 80% just as a starting point. So what we might want to explore here are the impacts of a couple of things. Number one, they could retire a little bit later. Maybe retiring at 62 isn't the best option because, look, there's always the chance that the market crashes and your portfolio value falls. Remember, when we were looking at this view here, we're assuming average returns every single year. When we run the Monte Carlo analysis, now we're including the probabilities that markets crash and what tends to happen after that. Now, if we have unfortunate timing and Jeff and Abby decide to retire immediately after the market crashes and their portfolio falls by 25%, which has happened a whole bunch of times over history and is something that we should expect to happen at least a couple times throughout our retirement, look at what happens to our Monte Carlo. This goes down substantially. Now, I will also add that every single time we've had a bear market, there is some bottom point. It seems like, and this is true in 2008, it was true in 2001, it was true in the 80s and the 60s, and then the 30s with the Great Depression. Every single time, it seems like the world is going to end and stock values are plummeting. But there is a bottom, and at some point the news improves and you wake up one morning and there is always a bounce off the bottom. What we've instructed the program to do here is to reduce portfolio values across the board at the moment that Jeff and Abby retire by 25% and then revert to the long-term averages. And that could absolutely happen. There are no guarantees in investing ever, but every single time we've hit a bear market, there is some kind of bounce off the bottom. So this is quite a pessimistic scenario. That being said, we don't have a whole lot of confidence that this is going to work too. So we might want to look at other options. So the easy one to evaluate here is, well, what if we postpone retirement by 1 year? And there's a couple benefits to that. Number one, you have one more year where you're putting money into the accounts and growing the size of the pile. You have one less year, theoretically, where you're living off those assets, right? Because your retirement is 1 year shorter if you defer your retirement. Therefore, the pile doesn't have to last you for quite as long. And it gives the pile an extra year to grow on its own and compound. So if we postpone that retirement for both Jeff and Abby by 1 year, now we're getting kind of to the area that we like to see. Now, keep in mind, we're looking at just portfolio assets here. Jeff and Abby have equity in their homes. They might be thinking about downsizing at some point. As a worst case scenario, if things get really bad and there are no other avenues, they could use the equity in their home in some way, shape, or form, either through a reverse mortgage or perhaps if they're considering moving into an assisted living facility. Oftentimes, that's when people think about selling their homes and then using the cash to put toward those costs. Again, there are a lot of variations of this. But my point is that retiring at 62 in this situation with 2.2 million is probably not going to work for these two. They're going to have to pull some other levers to see this probability of success grow. And one of them is retiring at 63. Another one of them could be spending a little bit less. Another could be downsizing. There are a whole bunch of variations. The whole point of the exercise is to make sure that the pile is big enough before you give up the income and step into retirement. And then once that's confirmed, you want to make sure that you're getting as a maximum amount of utility from that hard-earned savings, that money that you've put into the pile and have worked so hard to develop over the course of your career. All right, that's it for today's video. I hope you found it helpful. As you can see, Jeff and Abby are in a situation, they're retiring with $2.2 million invested across a couple different types of accounts. They want to spend $12,500 per month, and they want to retire at age 62, respectively. That might not be the best plan for them. They might still be able to retire at age 62, but they're probably going to need to pull one or more other levers. We talked about a few of them. Obviously, they could spend a little bit less. They could work for a little bit longer. One other avenue we didn't talk about was maybe they work part time for a few years doing something else. They could also take more investment risk, although that comes with obvious downsides. But if you're taking more investment risk, hopefully you're being rewarded with higher long-term returns. That stands to help things. They could also adjust their filing decision with regard to Social Security, either take that earlier to take less out of the portfolio from an earlier date, or postpone it after age 67 to increase their delayed retirement credits, which means they get more from Social Security down the road. You can see there are a lot of different levers that they can potentially pull. And the whole point of the exercise is to figure out which ones match your lifestyle and match your vision for what you want out of your retirement. We all have a different vision of what we want. The whole point of the exercise is to make sure that you're getting what you want and need from your resources to be happy and content. Right? We've all worked very hard to build up these retirement resources individually and across families. We need to make sure that we're good stewards of those resources over time. So that's it for today. Hope you found it helpful, and we'll see you again soon.